in this video, I am going to do a little bit of reading from this Goosebumps book, The Night of the Living Dummy. The most memorable one that I ever read when I was in elementary school. I saw this at Target a couple days ago. Oh my goodness, Princess is being creepy. Okay, anyway. And I thought it would be really good for making some tapping sounds and some paper sounds. And I thought that at the end of the video I would read a few chapters from it. I don't think it should be too scary. So, if you're easily frightened, maybe don't, listen to the reading part, but I really don't think it should be very scary. And I wanted to do something kind of Halloween themed, so I thought this would be a good idea. So, for the first few minutes, I'm just going to make some paper sounds and some tapping sounds, and then I'll jump into doing some reading. So, I hope you guys enjoy this video. Looking at Princess. I apologize about the clutter in the back. I've been packing because my birthday is this weekend, and I'm going to spend the weekend in DC visiting some family and hopefully doing some fun stuff for my birthday, so I'm leaving tomorrow. Some of the stuff I've been packing is back there, that's why I bring that up. other Goosebumps books. There's an advertisement for the movie starring Jack Black, which I have not seen. I'm sorry about the train sounds, by the way. Into the reading. Night of the Living Dummy. Chapter 1. Chris Powell struggled to get her twin sister's attention. Lindy Powell glanced up from the book she was reading to see what the problem was. Instead of her sister's pretty face, Lindy saw a round pink bubble nearly the size of Chris's head. "Nice one," Lindy said without much enthusiasm. With a sudden move, she poked the bubble and popped it. "Hey," Chris cried as the pink bubble gum exploded onto her cheeks and chin. Lindy laughed. "Gotcha." Chris angrily grabbed Lindy's paperback and slammed it shut. "Whoops," Lost your place, she exclaimed. She knew her sister hated to lose her place in a book. Lindy grabbed the book back with a scowl. Chris struggled to pull the pink gum off of her face. That was the biggest bubble I ever blew, she said angrily. The gum wasn't coming off her chin. I've blown much bigger than that, Lindy said with a superior sneer. I don't believe you two, their mother muttered, making her way into their bedroom and dropping a neatly folded pile of laundry at the foot of Chris's bed. You even compete over bubble gum? We're not competing, Lindy muttered. She tossed back her blonde ponytail and returned her eyes to the book. Both girls had straight blonde hair, but Lindy kept hers long, usually tying it behind her head or on one side in a ponytail. And Chris had hers cut very short. It was a way for people to tell the twins apart, for they were nearly identical in every other way. Both had broad foreheads and round blue eyes, both had dimples in their cheeks, and when they smiled, both blushed easily with large pink circles forming on their pale cheeks. Both thought their noses were a little too wide. Both wished they were a little taller. Lindy's best friend Alice was nearly 3 inches taller, even though she hadn't turned 12 yet. Did I get it all off? Chris asked, rubbing her chin, which was red and sticky. Not all, Lindy told her, glancing up. There's some in your hair. Great, Chris muttered. She grabbed her hair, but couldn't find any bubble gum. Gotcha again, Lindy said, laughing. You're too easy. Chris uttered an angry growl. Why are you always so mean to me? Me? Mean? Lindsay looked up in a wide-eyed innocence. I'm an angel, ask anyone. Exasperated, Chris turned back to her mother, who was stuffing socks into a dresser drawer. Mom, when am I going to get my own room? On the 12th of never, Mrs. Powell replied, grinning. Chris moaned. That's always what you say. Her mother shrugged. You know we don't have a spare inch, Chris. She turned it to the bedroom window. Bright sunlight streamed through the filmy curtains. It's a beautiful day. What are you two doing inside? Mom, we're not little girls, Lindy said, rolling her eyes. We're 12. We're too old to go out and play. Did I get it all? Chris asked, still scraping the pink patches of bubblegum off her chin. Leave it. It improves your complexion, Lindy told her. I wish you girls would be nicer to each other, Mrs. Powell said with a sigh. They suddenly heard shrill barking coming from downstairs. What's Barky excited about now? Mrs. Powell fretted. The little black terrier was always barking about something. Why not take Barky for a walk? Don't feel like it, Lindy muttered, nose in her book. What about those beautiful new bikes you got for your birthday? Mrs. Powell said, hands on her hips. Those bikes you just couldn't live without. You know, the ones that have been sitting in the garage since you two got them? Okay. You don't have to be sarcastic, Mom, Lindy said, closing her book. She stood up, stretched, and tossed the book onto her bed. You want to? Chris asked Lindy. Want to what? Go for a bike ride? We could ride to the playground to see if anyone's hanging out at school. You just want to see if Robbie is there, Lindsay said, making a face. So, Chris said, blushing. Go on, get some fresh air, Mrs. Powell urged. I'll see you later. I'm off to the supermarket. Chris peered into the dresser mirror. She had gotten most of the gum off. She had brushed her short hair back with both hands. Come on, let's go out, she said. Last one is a rotten egg. She darted to the doorway, beating her sister by half a step. As they burst out the back door, with Barky yipping shrilly behind them, the afternoon sun was high in a cloudless sky. The air was still and dry. It felt more like summer than spring. Both girls were wearing shorts and sleeveless t-shirts. Lindy bent to pull open the garage door, then stopped. The house next door caught her eye. Look, they've got the walls up, she told Chris, pointing across their backyard. That new house is going up so quickly. It's amazing, Chris said, following her sister's gaze. The builders had knocked down the old house during the winter. The new concrete foundation had been put down in March. Lindy and Chris walked around on it when no workers were there, trying to figure out where the different rooms would go. And now the walls had been built. The construction suddenly looked like a real house, rising up in the midst of tall stacks of lumber, a big mound of red-brown dirt, a pile of concrete blocks, and an assortment of power saws, tools, and machinery. "No one's working today," Lindy said. They took a few steps toward the house. "Who do you think will move in?" Chris wondered. "Maybe some great-looking guy our age. Maybe great-looking twin guys. Yuck." Lindy made a disgusted face. "Twin guys? How drippy can you get? I can't believe you and I are in the same family." Chris was used to Lindy's sarcasm. Both girls liked being twins and hated being twins at the same time. Because they shared nearly everything, their looks, their clothing, their room, they were closer than most sisters could ever get. But because they were so much alike, they also managed to drive each other crazy a lot of the time. "No one's around. Let's check out the new house," Lindy said. Chris followed her across the yard. A squirrel, halfway up the wide trunk of a maple tree, watched them warily. They made their way through an opening in the low shrubs that divided the 2 yards. Then, walking past the stacks of lumber and the tall mound of dirt, they climbed the concrete stoop. A sheet of heavy plastic had been nailed over the opening where the front door would go. Chris pulled one end of the plastic up, and they slipped into the house. It was dark and cool inside, and had a fresh wood smell. The plaster walls were up but hadn't been painted. "Careful," Lindy warned. "Nails." She pointed to the large nails scattered over the floor. "If you step on one, you'll get lockjaw and die." "You wish," Chris said. "I don't want you to die," Lindy replied. "Just get lockjaw." She snickered. "Ha ha," Chris said sarcastically. "This must be the living room," she said, making her way carefully across the front room to the fireplace against the back wall. "A cathedral ceiling," Lindy said, staring up at the dark, exposed wooden beams above their heads. "Neat." "This is bigger than our living room," Chris remarked, peering out the large picture window to the street. "It smells great," Lindy said, taking a deep breath. "All the sawdust, it smells so piney." They made their way through the hall and explored the kitchen. "Are those wires on?" Chris asked, pointing to a cluster of black electrical wires suspended from ceiling beams. "Why don't you touch one and find out?" Lindsay suggested. "You first," Chris shot back. "The kitchen isn't very big," Lindy said, bending down to stare into the holes where the kitchen cabinets would go. She stood up and was about to suggest that they check out the upstairs when she heard a sound. "Huh?" Her eyes widened in surprise. "Is someone here?" Chris froze in the middle of the kitchen. They both listened. Silence. They heard soft, rapid footsteps close by, inside the house. "Let's go," Lindsay whispered. Chris was already ducking under the plastic, heading out the doorway opening. She leaped off the back stoop and started running toward their backyard. Lindy stopped at the bottom of the stoop and turned back to the new house. "Hey, look," she called. A squirrel came flying out a side window. It landed on the dirt with all 4 feet moving and scrambled toward the maple tree in the Powell's yard. Lindsay laughed. "Just a dumb squirrel." Chris stopped near the low shrubs. "You sure?" She hesitated, watching the windows of the new house. "That was a pretty loud squirrel." When she turned back from the house, she was surprised to find that Lindy had disappeared. "Hey, where'd you go?" "Over here," Lindy called. "I see something." It took Chris a while to locate her sister. Lindy was half hidden behind a large black dumpster at the far end of the yard. Chris shielded her eyes with one hand to see the better. Lindy was bent over the side of the dumpster. She appeared to be rummaging through some trash. "What's in there?" Chris called. Lindy was tossing things around and didn't seem to hear. "What is it?" Chris called, taking a few reluctant steps towards the dumpster. Lindy didn't reply. Then slowly she pulled something out. She started to hold it up. Its arms and legs dangled down limply. Chris could see a head with brown hair. A head? Arms and legs? "Oh no," Chris cried aloud, raising her hands to her face in horror. Chapter 2. "A child?" Chris uttered a silent gasp, staring in horror as Lindy lifted him out of the dumpster. She could see his face frozen in a wide-eyed stare. His brown hair stood stiffly on top of his head. He seemed to be wearing some sort of gray suit. His arms and legs dangled lifelessly. "Lindy," Chris called, her throat tight with fear. Is he alive?" Her heart pounding, Chris started to run to her sister. Lindy was cradling the poor thing in her arms. Is he alive? Chris repeated breathlessly. She stopped short when her sister started to laugh. No, not alive, Lindy called gleefully. And then Chris realized that it wasn't a child after all. A dummy, she shrieked. Lindy held it up. A ventriloquist dummy, she said. Someone threw him out. Do you believe it? He's in perfect shape. It took Lindy a while to notice that Chris was breathing hard, her face bright red. Chris, what's your problem? Oh, wow. Did you think he was a real kid? Lindy laughed scornfully. No, of course not, Chris insisted. Lindy held the dummy up and examined his back, looking for the string to pull to make his mouth move. I am a real kid, Lindy made him say. She was speaking in a high-pitched voice through gritted teeth, trying not to move her lips. Dumb, Chris said, rolling her eyes. I am not dumb. You're dumb, Lindy made the dummy say in a high, squeaky voice. When she pulled the string in his back, the wooden lips moved up and down, clicking as they moved. She moved her hand up his back and found the control to make his painted eyes shift from side to side. He's probably filled with bugs, Chris said, making a disgusted face. Throw him back, Lindy. No way, Lindy insisted, rubbing her hand tenderly over the dummy's wooden hair. I'm keeping him. She's keeping me, she made the dummy say. Chris stared suspiciously at the dummy. His brown hair was painted on his head. His blue eyes moved only from side to side and couldn't blink. He had bright, red painted lips, curved up into an eerie smile. The lower lip had a chip on one side so that it didn't quite match the upper lip. The dummy wore a gray, double-breasted suit over a white shirt collar. The collar wasn't attached to a shirt. Instead, the dummy's wooden chest was painted white. Big brown leather shoes were attached to the ends of his thin, dangling legs. My name is Slappy, Lindy made the dummy say, moving his grinning mouth up and down. Dumb, Chris repeated, shaking her head. Why Slappy? Come over here and I'll slap you, Lindy made him say, trying not to move her lips. Chris groaned. Are we not going to ride our bikes to the playground, Lindy? Afraid poor Robbie misses you? Lindy made Slappy ask. Put that ugly thing down, Chris replied impatiently. I'm not ugly, Slappy said in Lindy's squeaky voice, sliding his eyes from side to side. You're ugly. Your lips are moving, Chris told Lindy. You're a lousy ventriloquist. I'll get better, Lindy insisted. You mean you're really keeping it? Chris cried. I like Slappy. He's cute, Lindy said, cuddling the dummy against the front of her t-shirt. I'm cute, she made him say, and you're ugly. Shut up, Chris snapped to the dummy. You shut up, Slappy replied in Lindy's tight, high-pitched voice. What do you want to keep him for? Chris asked, following her sister toward the street. I've always liked puppets, Lindy recalled. Remember those marionettes I used to have? I played with them for hours at a time. I made up long plays with them. I always played with the marionettes too, Chris remembered. You got the strings all tangled up, Lindy said, frowning. You weren't any good at it. But what are you going to do with this dummy? Chris demanded. I don't know. Maybe I'll work up an act, Lindy said thoughtfully, shifting Slappy to her other arm. I'll bet I could earn some money with him, appear at kids' birthday parties, put on shows. Happy birthday, she made Slappy declare. Hand over some money. Chris didn't laugh. The two girls walked along the street in front of their house. Lindy cradled Slappy in her arms, one hand up his back. I think he's creepy, Chris said, kicking a large pebble across the street. You should put him back in the dumpster. No way, Lindy insisted. No way, she made Slappy say, shaking his head, his glassy blue eyes moving from side to side. I'll put you in the dumpster. Slappy sure is mean, Chris remarked, frowning at Lindy. Lindy laughed. Don't look at me, she teased. Complain to Slappy, Chris scowled. You're jealous, Lindy said, because I found him and you didn't. Chris started to protest, but they both heard voices. Chris looked up to see two Marshall kids from down the block running toward them. They were cute red-headed kids that Lindy and Chris sometimes babysat for. What's that? Amy Marshall asked, pointing at Slappy. Does he talk? Her younger brother Ben asked, staying several feet away, an uncertain expression on his freckled face. Hi, I'm Slappy. Lindy made the dummy call out. She cradled Slappy in one arm, making him sit up straight, his arms dangling at his sides. Where'd you get him? Amy asked. Do his eyes move? Ben asked, still hanging back. Do your eyes move? Slappy asked Ben. Both Marshall kids laughed. Ben forgot his reluctance. He stepped up and grabbed Slappy's hand. Ouch, not so hard, Slappy cried. Ben dropped the hand with a gasp. Then he and Amy collapsed in gleeful laughter. Ha 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 ha. Lindy made Slappy laugh, tilting his head back and opening his mouth wide. The two kids thought that was a riot. They laughed even harder. Pleased by the response she was getting, Lindy glanced at her sister. Chris was sitting on the curb, cradling her head in her hands, a dejected look on her face. She's jealous, Lindsay realized. Chris sees that all the kids really like Slappy and that I'm getting all the attention, and she's totally jealous. I'm definitely keeping Slappy, Lindy told herself, secretly pleased at her little triumph. She stared into the dummy's bright blue painted eyes. To her surprise, the dummy seemed to be staring back at her, a twinkle of sunlight in his eyes, his grin wide and knowing. I'll read one more chapter. Chapter 3. Who was that on the phone? Mr. Powell asked, shoveling another forkful of spaghetti into his mouth. Lindy slipped back into her place at the table. It was Mrs. Marshall down the block. Does she want you to babysit? Mrs. Powell asked, reaching for the salad bowl. She turned to Chris. Do you want any salad? Chris wiped spaghetti sauce off her chin with her napkin. Maybe later. No, Lindsay answered. She wants me to perform at Amy's birthday party with Slappy. Your first job, Mr. Powell said, a smile crossing his slender face. Amy and Ben liked Slappy so much they insisted on him, Lindy said. Mrs. Marshall is going to pay me $20. That's great, their mother exclaimed. She passed the salad bowl across the table to her husband. It had been a week since Lindy rescued Slappy from the dumpster. Every day after school she had spent hours up in her room rehearsing with him, working on his voice, practicing not moving her lips, thinking up jokes to perform with him. Chris kept insisting that the whole thing was dumb. I can't believe you're being such a nerd, she told her sister. She refused to be an audience for Lindy's routines. But when Lindy brought Slappy into school on Friday, Chris's attitude began to change. A group of kids had gathered around Lindy outside her locker. As Lindy made Slappy talk for them, Chris watched from down the hall. She's going to make a total fool of herself, Chris thought. But to her surprise, the kids hooted and howled. They thought Slappy was a riot. Even Robbie Martin, the guy Chris had a crush on for 2 years, thought Lindy was terrific. Watching Robbie laugh along with the other kids made Chris think hard. Becoming a ventriloquist might be fun and profitable. Lindy was going to earn $20 at the Marshall's birthday party, and when word got around, she'd probably perform at a lot of parties and earn even more money. After dinner that evening, Lindy and Chris washed and dried the dishes. Then Lindy asked her parents if she could practice her new comedy routine on them. She hurried up to her room to get Slappy. Mr. and Mrs. Powell took a seat on the living room couch. Maybe Lindy will be a TV star, Mrs. Powell said. Maybe, Mr. Powell agreed, settling back on the couch, a pleased smile on his face. Barky yapped and climbed between Mr. and Mrs. Powell, his tiny stub of a tail wagging furiously. You know you're not allowed on the couch, Mrs. Powell said, sighing, but she made no move to push Barky off. Chris sat down away from the others on the floor by the steps, cradling her chin in her hands. You're looking glum this evening, her father remarked. Can I get a dummy too? Chris asked. She hadn't really planned to say it. The question just popped out of her mouth. Lindy came back into the room, carrying Slappy around the waist. Ready? She asked. She pulled a dining room chair to the center of the living room and sat down on it. Well, can I? Chris repeated. You really want one too? Mrs. Powell asked, surprised. Want what? Lindy asked, confused. Chris says she wants a dummy too, Mrs. Powell reported. No way, Lindy said heatedly. Why do you want to be such a copycat? It looks like fun, Chris replied. Her cheeks turned a bright pink. If you can do it, I can do it too, she added shrilly. You always copy everything I do, Lindy protested angrily. Why don't you find something of your own for once? Go upstairs and work on your junk jewelry collection. That's your hobby. Let me be the ventriloquist. Girls, Mr. Powell started, raising a hand for quiet. Please don't fight over a dummy. I really think I'd be better at it, Chris said. I mean, Lindy isn't very funny. Everyone thinks I'm funny, Lindy insisted. That's not very nice, Chris, Mrs. Powell scolded. Well, I just think if Lindy has one, I should be able to have one too, Chris said to her parents. Copycat, Lindy repeated, shaking her head. You've been putting me down all week. You said it was nerdy, but I know why you changed your mind. You're upset because I'm going to earn some money and you're not. I really wish you two wouldn't argue about everything, Mr. Powell said disgustedly. Well, can I have a dummy? Chris asked him. They're expensive, Mr. Powell replied, glancing at his wife. A good one will cost more than $100. I really don't think we can afford to buy one right now. Why don't you both share Slappy? Mrs. Powell suggested. Huh? Lindy's mouth dropped open in protest. You two always share everything, Mrs. Powell continued, so why don't you share Slappy? But Mom, Lindy whined unhappily. Excellent idea, Mr. Powell interrupted. He motioned to Chris. Try it out. After you share him for a while, I'm sure one of you will lose interest in him, maybe even both of you. Chris climbed to her feet and walked over to Lindy. She reached out for the dummy. I don't mind sharing, she said quietly, searching her sister's eyes for approval of the idea. Can I hold him for just a second? Lindy held on to Slappy tightly. Suddenly, the dummy's head tilted back and his mouth opened wide. Beat it, Chris, he snarled in a harsh, raspy voice. Get lost, you stupid moron. Before Chris could back away, Slappy's wooden hand shot up and he slapped her hard across the face. I'll read one more chapter so we can get into some of the scary stuff. Okay, chapter 4. Ow! Chris screamed and raised her hand to her cheek, which was bright pink. She stepped back. Stop it, Lindy, that hurt. Me? Lindy cried. I didn't do it. Slappy did. Don't be dumb, Chris protested, rubbing her cheek. You really hurt me. But I didn't do it, Lindy cried. She turned Slappy's face toward her. Why were you so rude to Chris? Mr. Powell jumped up from the couch. Stop acting dumb and apologize to your sister, he ordered. Lindy bowed Slappy's head. I'm sorry, she made the dummy say. No, in your own voice, Mr. Powell insisted, crossing his arms in front of his chest. Slappy didn't hurt Chris. You did. Okay, Lindy muttered, blushing. She avoided Chris's angry stare. I'm sorry. Here. She dumped Slappy into Chris's arms. Chris was so surprised she nearly dropped the dummy. Slappy was heavier than she imagined. Now what am I supposed to do with him? Chris asked Lindy. Lindy shrugged and crossed the room to the couch, where she dropped down beside her mother. Why'd you make such a fuss? Mrs. Powell whispered, leaning close to Lindy. That was so babyish. Lindy blushed. Slappy is mine. Why can't something be mine for once? Sometimes you girls are so nice to each other, and sometimes... Mrs. Powell's voice trailed off. Mr. Powell took a seat on the padded arm of the chair across the room. How do I make his mouth work? Chris asked, tilting the dummy upside down to examine its back. There's a string in his back, inside the slit in his jacket, Lindy told her grudgingly. You just pull it. I don't want Chris to work Slappy, Lindy thought unhappily. I don't want to share Slappy. Why can't I have something that just belongs to me? Why do I have to share everything with her? Why does Chris always want to copy me? She gritted her teeth and waited for her anger to fade. Later that night, Chris sat straight up in bed. She'd had a bad dream. I was being chased, she remembered, her heart still pounding. Chased by what? By whom? She couldn't remember. She glanced around the shadowy room, waiting for her heartbeat to return to normal. The room felt hot and stuffy, even though the window was open and the curtains were fluttering. Lindy lay sound asleep on her side in the twin bed next to Chris's. She was snoring softly, her lips slightly parted, her long hair falling loose around her face. Chris glanced at the clock radio on the bedside table between the two twin beds. It was nearly 3 a.m. Even though she was now wide awake, the nightmare wouldn't completely fade. She still felt uncomfortable, a little frightened, as if she were being chased by someone or something. The back of her neck felt hot and prickly. She turned and fluffed up her pillow, propping it higher on the headboard. As she lay back on it, something caught her eye. Someone was sitting in the chair in front of the bedroom window. Someone staring at her. After a sharp intake of breath, she realized it was Slappy. Yellow moonlight poured over him, making his staring eyes glow. He was sitting up in the chair, tilted to the right at a slight angle, one arm resting on the slender arm of the chair, his mouth locked in a wide, mocking grin. His eyes seemed to be staring right at Chris. Chris stared back, studying the dummy's expression in the eerie yellow moonlight. Then, without thinking, without even realizing what she was doing, she climbed silently out of bed. Her foot got tangled in the bedsheet and she nearly tripped. Kicking the sheets away, she made her way quickly across the room to the window. Sloppy stared up at her as her shadow fell over him. His grin seemed to grow wider as Chris leaned closer. A gust of wind made the soft curtains flutter against her face. Chris pushed them away and peered down at the dummy's painted head. She reached a hand out and rubbed his wooden hair, shining in the moonlight. His head felt warm, warmer than she'd imagined. Chris quickly jerked her hand away. What was that sound? Had Sloppy snickered? Had he laughed at her? No, of course not. Chris realized she was breathing hard. Why am I so freaked out by this stupid dummy, she thought. In the bed behind her, Lindy made a gurgling sound and rolled onto her back. Chris stared hard into Sloppy's big eyes, gleaming in the light from the window. She waited for him to blink or to roll his eyes from side to side. She suddenly felt foolish. He's just a stupid wooden dummy, she told herself. She reached out and pushed him over. The stiff body swung to the side. The hard head made a soft clonk as it hit the wooden arm of the chair. Chris stared down at him, feeling strangely dissatisfied, as if she'd somehow taught him a lesson. The curtains rustled against her face again. She pushed them away. Feeling sleepy, she started back to bed. She had only gone one step when Sloppy reached up and grabbed her wrist. This is always how this goes whenever I start reading something. Just one more chapter. Okay. Chapter 5. Oh! As the hand tightened around her wrist, Chris cried out and spun around. To her surprise, Lindy was crouched beside her. Lindy had a tight grip on Chris's wrist. Chris jerked her hand from Lindy's grasp. Moonlight through the window lit up Lindy's devilish grin. Gotcha again, she declared. You didn't scare me, Chris insisted, but her voice came out a trembling whisper. You jumped a mile, Lindy exclaimed gleefully. You really thought the dummy grabbed you. Did not, Chris replied. She hurried to her bed. What were you doing up anyway? Lindy demanded. Were you messing with Sloppy? No, I, just had a bad dream, Chris told her. I just went to look out the window. Lindy snickered. You should have seen the look on your face. I'm going back to sleep. Leave me alone, Chris snapped. She pulled the covers up to her chin. Lindy pushed the dummy back to a sitting position. Then she returned to her bed, still chuckling over the scare she'd given her sister. Chris rearranged the pillows, then glanced across the room to the window. The dummy's face was half covered in shadow now, but the eyes glowed as if he were alive, and they stared into hers as if they were trying to tell her something. Why does he have to grin like that? Chris asked herself, trying to rub away the prickling feeling on the back of her neck. She pulled up the sheet, settled into the bed, and turned on her side, away from the wide, staring eyes. But even with her back turned, she could feel them gazing at her. Even with her eyes closed and the covers pulled up to her head, she could picture this shadowy, distorted grin, the unblinking eyes, staring at her, staring. She drifted into an uncomfortable sleep, drifted into another dark nightmare. Someone was chasing her. Someone very evil was chasing her. But who? On Monday afternoon, Lindy and Chris both stayed after school to rehearse for the spring concert. It was nearly 5 when they arrived home, and they were surprised to see their dad's car in the driveway. You're home so early, Chris exclaimed, finding him in the kitchen helping their mother prepare dinner. I'm leaving tomorrow for a sales conference in Portland, Mr. Powell explained, peeling an onion over the sink with a small paring knife. So I only worked half a day today. What's for dinner? Lindy asked. Meatloaf, Mrs. Powell replied, if your father ever gets the onion peeled. There's a trick to not crying when you peel an onion, Mr. Powell said, tears rolling down his cheeks. Wish I knew it. How was chorus rehearsal? Mrs. Powell asked, eating a big ball of red ground beef in her hands. Boring, Lindy complained, opening the refrigerator and taking out a can of Coke. Yeah, we're doing all these Russian and Yugoslavian songs, Chris said. They're so sad. They're all about sheep or something. We don't really know what they're about. There's no translation. Mr. Pell rushed to the sink and began splashing cold water on his runny red eyes. I can't take this, he wailed. He tossed the half-peeled onion back to his wife. Crybaby, she muttered, shaking her head. Chris headed up the stairs to drop her backpack in her room. She tossed it onto the desk, and she shared with Lindy, then turned to go back downstairs. But something by the window caught her eye. Spinning around, she gasped. Oh no! The startled cry escaped her lips. Chris raised her hands to her cheeks and stared in disbelief. Slappy was propped up in the chair in front of the window, grinning at her with his usual wide-eyed stare, and seated behind him was another dummy, also grinning at her, and they were holding hands. What's going on here? Chris cried aloud. Okay, I'll leave it off there. So hopefully that wasn't super unsettling. I don't think it was that bad. But let me know if you guys liked this, and let me know if you would want to hear some more, maybe finish the book. The chapters are really short, so it probably wouldn't take too long. And there's like a bunch of random stuff in the back. So yeah, let me know if you guys enjoyed this video. And let me know if maybe you would want another reading video from this, or a reading video reading something else. I would understand that completely if you wanted something that isn't this. Also, I apologize for like clutter you might see in the background. I hope that you guys have a really good Halloween, and I'll see you in my next video.